Ah, ancient Greece, the land of philosophy, democracy, epic poetry, and eventually a whole lot of really, really bitter defeat. For centuries, the Greek world had dominated the Mediterranean. They had kings like Philip II, who turned a backwater kingdom into a military machine, and generals like his son, Alexander the Great, who took that machine and carved out an empire that stretched all the way to India. But when Alexander died, that massive empire was chopped up by his generals, the Diadochi, into a messy handful of rival kingdoms. The one we care about today is Macedon, which kept its original homeland and the most lethal army in the world, the Macedonian phalanx. For 100 years, these successor kingdoms Macedon, the Seleucids in Asia, the Ptolemies in Egypt were the absolute heavyweights of the world. No one could touch them. But while the Greeks were busy squabbling over who got to call themselves king, a new player was stirring in the West. A player so aggressively simple, so ruthlessly efficient, and so unbelievably persistent that it didn't just want a piece of the pie, it wanted the whole bakery. I'm talking, of course, about the Roman Republic. This is the story of how a series of forgotten, complicated, and utterly decisive conflicts, the Macedonian Wars, turned Rome from a scrappy Italian bully into the unquestioned master of the Mediterranean, shattering the legacy of Alexander the Great forever. To understand the wars, you have to understand the two civilizations colliding. On one side, the Hellenistic world. Think dazzling intellectual achievement. They inherited the greatest treasures, libraries, and scientific knowledge of the ancient world. Their kings were refined, spoke impeccable Greek, and led armies that perfected the science of warfare. Their go-to formation was the phalanx, a massive block of men armed with the sarissa, a spear up to 18 feet long. When that block marched, it was an unstoppable hedge of pointy death. It was sophisticated, it was beautiful, and it was crucially inflexible. On the other side, the Roman Republic, simple, brutal, practical, they weren't focused on philosophy. They were focused on roads, laws, and kicking ass. Their military was the legion, a flexible, segmented force of maniple, small blocks of troops. Their weapon was the gladius, a short, stabbing sort of close quarters meat grinder. A legate didn't need a fancy name or an education in poetry. He just needed to win. The Hellenistic world saw Rome as an upstart, a provincial bully only good at fighting other barbarian tribes. They were wrong. The first crack in the system appears not in Greece, but way over in Italy during Rome's most terrifying moment, the Second Punic War. The year is 217 BC. Rome has just been utterly pulverized by Hannibal at the Battle of Cannae. The Republic is bleeding, terrified, and fighting for its life. This sounds like the perfect time to back the winning horse, right? Enter King Philip V of Macedon. He's young, ambitious, and looking to expand his power across the Adriatic Sea into Illyria, modern Albania. When Hannibal sends an envoy after Cannae, Philip V doesn't hesitate. He signs the Treaty of Alliance with Hannibal into 15 BC. The message: hey Hannibal, you take Rome, we'll take the eastern side of the Adriatic. Deal. Now, to be clear, Philip V never actually sent troops to help Hannibal invade Italy. He was too busy fighting local Greek and Illyrian enemies, and Rome's navy did a decent job of blockading him. But just the threat of a Macedonian invasion on their eastern flank was enough for the Romans. They couldn't send a huge army, so they did the next best thing. They made friends with Philip's enemies. The Romans, being clever little foxes, spent the First Macedonian War to 14 to 205 BC doing exactly what they excelled at: divide and conquer. They backed the Aetolian League and the Kingdom of Pergamon, both Greek powers terrified of Philip's growing strength. Rome's goal wasn't to conquer Macedon, it was simply to keep Philip V too busy to help Hannibal. It was a holding action, a distraction. The war was mostly a complicated, messy Greek squabble, with Rome dipping in and out like a particularly nosy neighbor. It ended with the Peace of Phoenix in 205 BC. The result? Status quo mostly. Philip kept his Illyrian conquests. Rome got a peace treaty and a guarantee of their own allies' borders. However, the peace was a lie. Rome had now established a presence in the Greek world and a growing list of powerful Greek allies who saw Rome as their only hope against Philip V, the Hellenistic kings of the East. Still recovering from decades of internal fighting, looked at Rome and thought, phew, crisis averted. Back to our royal dramas. Philip V, post-Punic War, was feeling bold. Rome was exhausted, right? Time to start picking on the smaller Hellenistic states like Rhodes and Pergamon, the same Roman allies Rome had just sworn to protect. Those allies immediately sent a frantic telegram to Rome. Help, Philip is being a menace. The Roman Senate, now full of swagger after the defeat of Hannibal, loved this. They sent Philip an ultimatum: stop attacking our friends. Philip V basically laughed and told them to get lost. Rome declared war in 200 BC this time. They didn't send a half-hearted force. This was the full might of the Roman Republic, freshly blooded from the Punic Wars. This was the clash of the two military philosophies we talked about: flexible legion versus impregnable phalanx. For 3 years, it was a slow, messy grind across Thessaly and Macedon. Rome had the brilliant Titus Quinctius Flamininus in command, a Roman who adored Greek culture and used diplomacy as sharply as his sword. Flamininus played the Greek city-states perfectly, promising them freedom from Macedon. Why fight for Philip V when Rome offers you independence? Many cities flipped. Philip V found himself increasingly isolated. It all came down to one messy, foggy morning in 197 BC, on a ridge in Thessaly known as Cynocephalae at Dogs' Heads. The Macedonian phalanx was deployed on the ridge. That 18-foot sarissa hedge was terrifying, but the terrain was the phalanx's enemy. The phalanx needed flat, open ground to function as a unified, unbreaking wall. The hilly, broken ground of Cynocephalae meant the massive formation got segmented and messy. When the Macedonian right wing, led by Philip V himself, smashed the Roman left, it looked like a classic Macedonian victory. The Roman line bent, broke, and ran. But here's the key: the legion was flexible. The Roman right wing, which had held its ground, saw the Macedonian left wing disorganized by the terrain. And then, a single, unnamed Roman military tribune, a young officer, made a legendary, spontaneous decision. He didn't follow the plan. He didn't wait for orders. He took 20 maniples, about 2,000 men, and instead of pursuing the defeated Macedonian wing, he circled around the ridge. He marched right into the flank and rear of Philip's victorious phalanx. The phalanx, designed to be unstoppable from the front, was utterly helpless from the side or behind. Those giant sarissas couldn't turn fast enough. The legions threw aside their shields and swords and simply started to stab the Macedonians in the open gaps. It wasn't a tactical duel, it was a slaughter. Philip V's army was shattered. 13,000 Macedonian casualties compared to 1,000 Roman. The result, Rome didn't annex Macedon yet. Flamininus, the Greek lover, declared the freedom of the Greeks at the Isthmian Games a massive propaganda victory. Philip V lost everything outside of Macedon, paid a massive indemnity, gave up his entire fleet, and became a client king to Rome. The victory at Cynocephalae didn't just smash the Macedonian army. It sent shock waves through the entire Hellenistic world. To the east, the largest, most powerful, and arguably the last truly capable successor kingdom was the Seleucid Empire, led by a man they called Antiochus III the Great. Antiochus had spent decades re-establishing control over his vast territory, which stretched from Turkey to the borders of India. He had conquered provinces, subjugated rebellious governors, and was now the single greatest military power in the world, with a standing army that dwarfed anything Rome had seen since Hannibal. While Rome was busy with Philip V, Antiochus was busy consolidating a truly colossal empire. He saw Rome's liberation of the Greeks not as noble altruism, but as a blatant power grab, which, frankly, it was. Antiochus had a very real, non-negotiable problem. Rome was encroaching on his sphere of influence in the Aegean Sea and Asia Minor. The spark that lit the next conflict came from a familiar enemy, Hannibal Barca. After his defeat at Zama, the great Carthaginian general was in exile, and where did he flee? Straight to the court of Antiochus III in the Seleucid capital. Hannibal, still nursing his endless grudge against Rome, became Antiochus's chief military advisor, constantly urging the king to strike before Rome became too strong. Antiochus, confident in his own immense power, didn't need much convincing. More importantly, the Aetolian League, those fickle Greek allies Rome had used to fight Philip V, were now furious. They felt Rome's freedom was just a thinly veiled occupation. They felt slighted and powerless. So, they turned their backs on Rome and invited Antiochus to cross over into Greece and liberate them from their supposed liberators. This was the opening Antiochus needed. Magnesia was a catastrophe for Antiochus III. His power in Asia Minor was completely broken. The resulting Treaty of Apamea in 188 BC was utterly devastating for the Seleucids. Antiochus had to pay a colossal indemnity, the equivalent of 350 tons of silver, crippling his economy. He had to surrender his entire navy, restrict his army, and, most importantly, cede all territory west of the Taurus Mountains to Rome's allies. Rome still refused to annex the land directly, instead handing it to their friends, like Rhodes and Pergamon, thereby creating a buffer zone of dependent states. Rome's strategy was clear: weaken the giants, strengthen the dependencies, and avoid the administrative cost of direct rule for now. This victory established Rome as the dominant power in the entire Mediterranean, west and east. The only major surviving Hellenistic power left was the kingdom of Macedon, which was still simmering with resentment. The stage was set for the final act. Philip V, humbled and forced into an alliance with Rome, died in 179 BC. He was succeeded by his fiercely anti-Roman son, Perseus. Perseus was ambitious and watched Rome's creeping influence with alarm. He began to do exactly what his father did: expand his influence in the Balkans, build up his army, and forge new alliances with the remaining Greek states who were tired of Rome's heavy-handed freedom. He was popular among the common people who preferred a Macedonian king they knew to a distant Roman senator they didn't. Rome, through its network of spies and allies, chiefly humans to of Pergamon, Rome's reliable lapdog, quickly caught wind of Perseus's efforts. The Roman Senate, already sensitized to the dangers of ambitious kings in the east, didn't hesitate this time. They saw Perseus as a direct threat to the regional order they had carefully crafted. In 171 BC, Rome declared the Third Macedonian War. This was personal. This was decisive. Rome was done with diplomatic games. They were going for the jugular. The early years of the war were a humiliating struggle for Rome. Perseus was a surprisingly capable commander, and the Macedonian army, fighting on its home turf, inflicted several stinging defeats on the initial, overconfident Roman consular armies. The war dragged on for frustrating years, turning into a drain on Roman manpower and morale. The Roman legions were not used to being checked so effectively. It took the appointment of a new, highly capable consul, Lucius Aemilius Paulus, to turn the tide. Paulus was an old-school Roman general, strict, disciplined, and utterly ruthless. He restored discipline to the demoralized legions and marched deep into Macedon, forcing a final, inescapable confrontation. The ultimate showdown came on June 22, 168 BC, at the Battle of Pydna. The final, fatal confrontation came at the Battle of Pydna in 168 BC. It was the ultimate test, the last stand of the Macedonian phalanx against the Roman legion, and the showdown that would determine the fate of the Mediterranean world. The Roman general Lucius Aemilius Paulus was facing King Perseus on a relatively flat plain, which was the perfect ground for the Sarissa-armed phalanx. Perseus unleashed his full might, 20,000 men in a dense, bristling formation. As the phalanx advanced, it was a terrifying sight, a seemingly impenetrable wall of steel tips charging forward. For a moment, the Roman legions recoiled. The sheer momentum and density of the phalanx were overwhelming. The Roman front lines could barely hold. Paulus later admitted that the sight of the advancing Macedonian hedge was the most terrifying thing he had ever witnessed. It was a perfect execution of the classical Greek military doctrine. But the day was brutally hot, and the Macedonian line had to cross a small river and some uneven terrain to press the attack. Even on a seemingly perfect field, the sheer length of the line, 20,000 men, meant that the formation inevitably developed gaps. This wasn't a flaw in the men, but a flaw in the system. The phalanx was a unit, not a collection of independent fighters. The Roman legion, however, was designed to be schizophrenic. It was an army made up of hundreds of tiny, flexible units called maniples. When Paulus saw the Macedonian line momentarily buckle and separate, he didn't panic. He ordered his legionaries not to fight the wall, but to flood the cracks. He commanded his men to break formation and plunge into the gaps between the Macedonian battalions. This maneuver was the difference between Bronze Age warfare and the Roman military revolution. The phalangite soldier, weighed down by his sarissa, was helpless when the fighting became close quarters. He had no room to swing his tiny side sword. The Roman legionary, armed with the deadly, short-stabbing gladius and the large, protective scutum shield, was a close combat machine. Once the Romans were inside the phalanx's defense, the battle turned from a slow push into a chaotic massacre. The sarissa became a liability, tripping the soldiers. The Macedonian formation, designed to stand together, was being eaten alive from within by hundreds of isolated fights. The battle lasted less than an hour. 20,000 Macedonians were killed and 11,000 were captured. The Roman losses were negligible. Perseus fled, but he was captured shortly after and paraded in chains during Paulus's magnificent Roman triumph.